breaking news in the escape from Dannemora. Escape prisoner David Sweat is back in Plattsburgh this morning. He was here for his arraignment. District Attorney Andrew Wiley is sharing some comments about that. We listen in live right now.
At which time he was arraigned on the indictment 47I-15-1019, which you either should all have a copy of or my staff can provide that to you. The indictment contains 3 counts. There are 2 counts of escape in the first degree and 1 count of promoting prison contraband in the first degree. The 2 charges of escape in the first degree are just different elements of the same crime, not indicating that there were 2 escapes. It was just 1 escape with separate elements on each of those charges, and the promoting prison contraband charge involves the possession of the hacksaw blades while inside the correctional facility. David Sweat was transported this morning by Department of Corrections to Clinton Correctional Facility from 5 Points Correctional Facility, and he has now left the courthouse and is on his way back to 5 Points Correctional Facility. Mr. Musha has offices here in Plattsburgh. I'm not sure if he's been out here yet or not, but you'll have the opportunity to speak with him. And his office is located here in Plattsburgh, just on the other side of the building. He is a court-appointed attorney for David Sweat. The maximum sentences that the court could impose with David Sweat on these charges is a 3.5 to 7 year indeterminate sentence. On the promoting prison contraband, all 3 are Class D felonies, so it is once again a 3.5 to 7 year indeterminate sentence. Those sentences, the escape and promoting prison contraband, could be imposed consecutive to each other. The sentences in whole would have to be imposed consecutive to the sentence that Mr. Sweat is currently serving. We all know that's a life without parole sentence at this point in time. But those are the sentences that the court could impose, along with a $5,000 fine on each charge should he be convicted after trial of those matters, or after a plea is entered by Mr. Sweat. It's a little windy here. You all know I have somewhat of a difficult time hearing on the left side, so if you guys are going to get a question and just ask me that, I'll try to address those, and we'll take a few questions at this time. And if you don't have a copy of the if you don't have a copy of the indictment and you don't get one here, we can email you that. Just send an email to us at da@co.clinton.ny.us, and if somebody could pick those up for me, I'd appreciate it.
Andrew, I know
yes.
you've addressed this before, but for
yes.
people who are just watching now and wondering why a guy who's already been sentenced to life without parole would be processed, charged on an escape.
Right.
What's the point?
The point is that David Sweat and Richard Matt committed a crime in Clinton County. They committed the crime of escape in the first degree, and it's my job as the prosecutor in this county to prosecute the people that commit crimes within this county. And that is the bottom line. He committed a crime here in this county, and I am prosecuting him for that crime.
Could he get further punishment behind bars, extra solitary confinement, worse conditions?
The status of a new conviction for escape in the first degree, promoting prison contraband, could result in the Department of Corrections treating him in a more severe way than they currently would had he not escaped. As we all know, he was in a honor block at Clinton Correctional Facility up through June 5th, 2015. And in the early morning hours of June 6, 2015, it was discovered that he and Richard Matt had escaped from the facility. So he would be subject to those conditions that the Department of Corrections would establish and set on him, which would be special housing. He's currently, I believe, in special housing now, limited to 23 hours a day in his cell block with a 1-hour time period outside of his immediate cell block.
What happened in judges' chambers, and also
sure.
In the courtroom? I noticed you looked over at him a couple of times. You finally got your man. What did you see when you looked over at him?
Let me address the second part. And it's not a situation of getting my man, because I prosecute people that commit crimes in this county, as I said earlier. and that's what I was elected to do, and I will continue to do that. Actually, Jay Cook is the person who got my man, all right, and he is the person who needs to be credited for that. The incredible work that each and every law enforcement agency did, but in particular on that day in June in Franklin County, where Sergeant Cook was able to observe, recognize, and then apprehend David Sweat. That's the man that needs to be recognized. Regarding your first question, well, I'll go back to the second too. And David Sweat, my just observations of him are, he's obviously, you noticed he was in a sling today, and it's my understanding in speaking with the officials that he's still recovering from the gunshot wounds that at the time he was apprehended, and that is just a medical condition that's being continued with treatment for those gunshot wounds. He was cooperative. He was in dealing with the arraignment process today. He did not speak at all. I did not speak with him during that period of time. Relative to the court calling us into chambers today, there was a typographical error in the indictment, so we had that revised, and that was the main reason of going back into chambers at that time.
Andrew, can you take us to the next step? Is this going to trial?
Right. Well, that's totally subject to Mr. Sweat and Mr. Muscia. We're in a situation where on the 29th of September, we're having a pretrial conference. We'll make a determination whether he will enter a plea of guilty to the charge or charges that are pending against him, and what the potential sentence could be. It may be a situation where he just pleads to the indictment and leaves sentencing to Judge McGill. That's an option. My alternative is just a 3.5 to 7 year sentence on top of what he's presently serving.
You said that the escape charges are two elements of the same escape.
Correct.
Can you elaborate on that and explain that?
Sure. The New York State penal law has different provisions and elements for a multitude of charges, whether it's driving while intoxicated. You can be arrested on a driving while intoxicated charge for having a blood alcohol level of 0.08 or higher in New York State. You can also be charged with common law DWI. So it's 1192-2 and 1192-3. Every time that you're charged with a driving while intoxicated charge in New York State under those conditions, you're going to get charged with both elements. So in this case, if you have the indictment, you can see clearly in the provisions where the first count is the defendant in the state of New York on or about June 6, 2015, when having been convicted of a felony, he escapes from a detention facility. Those are the elements of the first count. The elements of the second count are the defendant in the state of New York, County of Clinton, on or about June 6, 2015, having been convicted of a Class A or B felony, escapes from custody. So those are the elements in those two charges.
You also said that you
Hold on a second, everybody. One more.
You
Go ahead.
also said that you are going to prosecute anyone in the county who commits a crime. There's been a lot of rumor and reporting about corrections officers
assaulting inmates?
Assaulting inmates.
Right.
What's your status in the investigation? What's going on there?
When paperwork gets put on my desk, I'll be able to respond to that. Until then, I have no comment. I haven't seen anything on it, other than the reports that have been put out in the media.
What would be the purpose of going to trial? I mean, it seems like if it goes to trial, it would be a big waste of taxpayer money and whatnot. As you've already said, he's not going to get any more time.
Right.
What would be his purpose? We know what your purpose is, prosecute to the fullest extent. Why bother?
Well, it's probably a situation where, that's a question you have to talk to Mr. Muscia and Mr. Sweat on. As far as the actual trial proceeding, June 5th, he's at Clinton Correctional Facility. June 6th, he's not. At the end of June, he's taken into custody in Franklin County. As far as our office is concerned, we'll go whatever way we have to prosecute Mr. Sweat. And if it is the issue of going to trial, I don't expect that it will, although it will be an expense to the county, it won't be a great expense.
Andrew, why didn't he enter a plea today?
That's totally subject to the defendant and his attorney making a determination whether he's going to plead guilty or not at this point in time. Mr. Sweat was just brought into court. As you all know, this is the first time he's faced criminal charges in this proceeding. So with that being the first time, today is also the first date that he's met with Mr. Muscia. So I think Mr. Muscia wants to probably, I can't speak for Mr. Muscia, but take the time to go over everything with David Sweat, explore whatever options they have, and then, potentially when we come back to court on September 29th, determine whether we do a plea or not. Hold on a second. I'll go right here. Hold on a second. Go ahead.
It came out that they had escaped the night before and then gone back into the facility. Could you have charged him with escape in that case?
We could have charged him with escape if we had the proof other than his statement that they did that. We have no reason to believe that it didn't occur. But then we're dealing with that situation. How far do we go with the prosecution? Do I charge him with every count of possession of a hacksaw blade from January through June to the escape, or do we just take care of the basic elements of this and move forward with it? And that's what we're doing.
Can you update us on the middle?
Go ahead. Hold on a second.
To your knowledge, or have you had any communication with the Franklin County attorneys to find out if we'll see him in court there on suspected robbery?
I have been speaking with Acting District Attorney Glenn McNeil. Glenn McNeil, because of the nature of the charges, the potential charges in Franklin County, relative to the burglaries, relative to trespass charges, I think they are still collecting DNA evidence. They're still putting that case together, and at that point in time, Mr. McNeil will make a determination. You'll have to obviously get his position on it, but he'll make a determination whether to move forward with charges against David Sweat in Franklin County.
Mr. Wiley, what about that $5,000 fine, and what happens if you can't pay that?
Well, the court would impose a judgment against Sweat, and obviously, in addition to the fine, we'd be seeking restitution be ordered, but I don't have any chance of getting restitution out of David Sweat as it stands right now, with him being in prison for life without parole. But I'll at least make that part of his plea offer. He's the one who escaped. But the court would take a judgment, and any money in the situation where he was before, working in the tailor shop, he receives pay for that. And so what will happen in a lot of those situations is they'll put a judgment, or an order at least. Department of Corrections will take a portion of that out, weekly, monthly, however often the inmate gets paid, and then that money would go towards the fines or towards restitution if that's the case.
Could you update us on the Mitchell and Palmer case?
Well, let's just deal with Sweat first before we move on to anything of that nature.
To clarify, the attorney said he's not making a plea, but then the judge said a plea of not guilty.
Yeah, I mean, at this point in time, it's a not guilty plea entered by David Sweat. It was entered on his behalf by the court. I think that's just tomato type of thing, and it's an informality that did not occur. But
And the contraband specifically is
hacksaw blades. It's hacksaw blades that were taken, that were secured in the morning of June 6th from inside the tunnel, inside the steam pipe, to be in particular.
no other tools that he may have used, just hacksaw blades.
Just a hacksaw blade.
Can you clarify one more time? So it's 3.5
Hold on a second. Go ahead.
to 7 years for each charge? Or,
That's the maximum sentence on each charge.
and then it's 5,000 for each charge.
5,000 for each charge. Yes. Anyone else relative to Sweat? Or yeah, to David Sweat. Yes. Sorry.
What could be the possible benefit to him to plead guilty at this point? Because I know sometimes you can make plea deals, but is that even an option?
Any benefit to Mr. Sweat, you're going to have to talk to Mr. Sweat about, or his attorney.
So you can't offer him or will be offering him?
I'm prosecuting him for these charges, and in all likelihood, the sentencing may be left up to the court in the end, but I'll be asking for the 3.5 to 7 on the escape charges.
Mr. Wiley, there was originally we thought that this would all happen behind prison walls, video conference. How did it end up that he was in person in court today? I thought there was a safety issue.
Right. Well, the Department of Corrections, in my speaking with the counsel's office, indicated to me that they felt it would be a safe environment to bring him to the county, to transport him here, to have him arraigned, and that we weren't dealing with any issues of having to deal with the court through video conferencing, that They felt it was a safe environment, so they agreed to proceed in that manner.
Did he request to be in?
Not at all. He had no idea he was being brought to Plattsburgh today.
And what was his demeanor like in the judge's chambers? You were a couple feet
The
away.
same that you saw in court. Same exact thing you saw in court. No different.
Just want to clarify, you were wearing the sling for injuries sustained during the capture?
Sorry?
Is that why you were wearing the sling for injuries sustained during the capture?
Yes, 2 gunshot wounds he received.
Is he still being held? Are they bringing him back to 5 points? Is that where he's going right now?
Yes, to bring him back to 5 points.
And that's where he will remain.
Until further notice.
How far is that from here?
Captain? 5 hours.
Mitchell and Paul, we're talking about that now.
All right, yeah.
Mitchell and Paul.
Y'all better start driving pretty fast if you want to catch him. All right, so let's talk about Joyce Mitchell first. All right, Joyce Mitchell's case is scheduled for June 28th. So I guess I'll be seeing you guys 2 days. Pardon? September. What did I say? June?
Yeah.
Thank you. September 28th. So I guess I'll be seeing you for 2 days in a row. It looks like, possibly. But right now she's still incarcerated at the county jail. As far as I know, are there any people here from NBC? I guess they got an interview with Joyce last week at the jail, so that took place from what I understand. But she's waiting sentencing in September. The probation department is conducting their pre-sentence investigation report of her. There are no new charges that are going to be filed based on the investigations that have been conducted and concluded with the New York State Police, the IG's office, and my office. I know we're getting a lot of media questions, a lot of questions from the public asking, why isn't she being charged with the rape of David Sweat or Richard Matt? As I indicated last month, I can't prove it. I can't prove it on her statements alone. I can't prove it on a dead man's statement. So I don't have proof to charge her with that. If I did, if I could go to trial on those charges, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, we would have prosecuted her.
If Joyce or Lionel Mitchell make money selling their story, either now or after she's out of prison,
Right.
will the state be able to get that money?
That's certainly a question that we are reviewing, and I would anticipate that the state would be looking at that as well. Relative to any issues of Joyce Mitchell's attorney, assigned counsel, or being paid, that's an issue that I'm not going to comment on, and it's not in my realm to be dealing with that issue. That's something for her attorney and the county to be dealing with. Any other questions on Joyce Mitchell? Okay, relative to Gene Palmer, I have Mr. Palmer's cases are still pending, obviously. I have reopened discussions with his counsel, reviewing all possible charges against Mr. Palmer and how the Clinton County District Attorney's Office will deal with those charges. I do not have information presently on what his status, ongoing status with the Department of Corrections is. That's not really something that I'm going to focus on. But I have been discussing the charges with his counsel, and we continue to do that throughout the investigation.
For a deal, you're talking about a deal?
We're negotiating potentially how his case could be resolved without going to trial that would benefit the county. Obviously, dispose of the matter in a timely manner to avoid a lengthy trial on the matter. Hold Mr. Palmer accountable for his involvement in this matter, whether it was knowingly or unknowingly. Those are still issues that we're working out.
Mr. Wiley, are there any other COs you're looking at this point?
Negative.
And just to clarify, last time you said negotiations with Palmer's counsel had failed.
That's correct. Things change. Wake up. It's a new day. So, anything else?
Any other inmates?
Negative. Is that it? All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.